Hello everyone, welcome to World Dairy Expo. This morning's seminar is Hope and Hard Work, Mental Health and Agriculture, presented by Monica Kramer-McConkey, who is an Ag Mental Health Counselor for Eyes on the Horizon Consulting, LLC. Stressors in ag production are like no other, as many of you know, and can often impact the producers and their families' mental and physical health. In this seminar, we will look at why stress in agriculture is so significant and understand what happens to us when we become stressed and look at ways that we can cope. This is a presentation for anyone in or around agriculture that you'll want to hear. Monica Kramer-McConkey is a licensed professional counselor, LPC, who has been in the field for 28 years. She grew up on a farm in northwest Minnesota and has an intimate understanding of the unique stressors in agriculture. McConkey works with farmers, ranchers, and their families every day to help them feel better and improve their relationships. When she was younger, she showed her milking shorthorn calves at World Dairy Expo and is excited to be back. And as a personal note, I work with DATCAP, Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, and the Farm Center, and Monica and her colleague Ted were incredibly helpful to us in giving us some guidance and advice when we started our farmer wellness services, which we have some postcards in the back about if you're interested in knowing. At this time, I would like to ask everyone to please silence your cell phone. And Monica, the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Had to make sure my cell phone was silenced. Wouldn't that be something? I do. Can everybody hear me? Okay. So good to be here. As she said, I used to show calves here, and it's just like so nostalgic to come back and see the ring and see the barns and any pictures I have of me as a kid here, I'm either crying or sleeping. So I'm like, not showing any of those. It was stressful times. So we're going to talk today about a number of things. This hour is going to fly right by. But I want to leave room so that if you guys have situations or questions you want to talk through, that we make space for that. So you're getting out of this what you want to get out of this. So I've got slides I'll be running through, but let's keep it interactive. Let's keep it super informal. And so if you've got something you want to share, a question you want to ask, let's just do it. If we don't have to wait till the end, okay? All right, so I already got a great introduction. As she said, grew up on a farm in northwest Minnesota. My son is actually the 5th generation on our family farm, so he works with my brother and my parents. All crops at this point. We had beef and hogs on occasion over the years, just depending on markets, but I showed dairy because I was one of those kids that couldn't handle the thought of, bonding with a beef animal for 2 years and then it being in my freezer. So we showed milky shorthorn calves we got from a neighboring dairy farmer, and he's really the one that kind of drug us all around, all kinds of open class shows outside of 4-H, including the Expo. So amazing experience. And then a quick little bit of trivia for you all. I was the 1987 Minnesota Milking Shorthorn Queen. And it's like, oh, that's so wonderful, but then I have to tell people I was the only contestant that year. And so had I not been chosen, that would have been a real hit to the ego. But grew up on the farm, and that's definitely where my heart lies. And when I began my work with farmers really full-time about, actually 5 years ago, October 1st, I opened my private practice and started working almost exclusively with farmers and ranchers and their families. I've grown more in love with the industry and the people. I feel like I'm working with my family every time I'm on a call or on a farm or on a Zoom session with someone. So we're going to talk about stress. We're going to talk about what happens internally when we get stressed, and then we're going to talk about ways to cope with it. But before we go there, how many of you in the room are producers? You're farmers, you have, okay. And would the rest of you identify yourselves like ag industry? Okay, so you work with producers, would you say? Okay, so you're working with people who are often chronically stressed. So we have a good mix. So I tried to put something in here for both producers that are living the life and experiencing it, as well as people in the industry who are working with those folks. So I always start especially with industry folks or people outside of agriculture, talking about the culture of farming and ranching, because if you don't get it, you really don't get it. And I have had so many farmers tell me, I tried counseling with somebody and they were saying things to me like, sell the farm, live life, go on a vacation, cut down your work hours. And it's like they didn't get it. And so I start always by talking about the agrarian imperative. And this, anybody from Iowa in here? Okay. This term was coined by Dr. Michael Roseman, who is a psychologist and a farmer in Iowa. And he's been doing this work for many, many, many years. I think he's 80 something. But basically, he was looking at why do farmers put themselves through the pain and hardship that they put themselves through in order to be able to farm. And out of that, he coined the term the agrarian imperative. And even for some farmers, this is enlightening because they're like, I don't know why I'm doing this. It doesn't make any sense. I'm going to work all year. I'm going to lose money at the end of the year. I already know this in January, but I'm going to put myself through all this. It's not about the money, right? So I have a couple of Dr. Roseman's quotes here. So the first one, to farmers, the land is everything. Ownership of a family farm is the triumphant result of the struggles of multiple generations. Losing the family farm is the ultimate loss, bringing shame to the generation that has let down their forebears and dashing the hopes for successors. So basically, it's like in our DNA to farm. And we will do it at all costs. We'll hold on to the land, hold on to the livestock in whatever way we can. Second quote, the agrarian imperative impels farmers to hang on to their land at all costs. It instills farmers to work incredibly hard, to endure unusual pain and hardship, and to take uncommon risks. And if you're a farmer, you work with farmers, you see this every day, that despite financial hardship, despite physical injury and ailment, despite relationship breakdown, we're going to keep this going. Like there's no other option. That is important to understand when we're talking about stress and mental health in agriculture, because it's not as simple as saying, get a different job, you have all these skills, you can do something else, because the farm identifies the producers, who they are. It's innate to them. So we have to know that and accept that. So then we look at all the factors that impact the health of our, and when I just use the term farmer very generally, male, female, farmer, rancher. I know ranchers don't like to be called farmers, but it is what it is. So when I say farmer, just know I'm not talking about just, 55-year-old male. I'm talking about it all-encompassing. So factors that impact the health of our producers. There's a number of them, right? And many of you already know these things. At the top of the list are those uncontrollables. This has been a tough weather year in a lot of ways. Crops in many areas are not looking great. There's going to be low commodity markets, it sounds like, for the next few years is what I'm hearing. So difficult times. General uncertainty, global economy, the whole political climate right now impacts and is completely outside of our control. And then you have other things. Agriculture is right at the top of the list for most dangerous occupations when you look at OSHA's list. People work in isolation oftentimes. There's competition, especially for land, between neighboring and sometimes not neighboring farmers, which drives even more of the stigma, like I can't let people know I'm not doing okay. And I hear this, I hear farmers say that I don't want people in the community to find out I'm struggling because they're going to go to landlord, tell landlord, you know, so-and-so's not doing so well, I'll give you a little bit more per acre, and then it'll be secure. And that's the fear. And so they don't seek help. They kind of drive things more down inside of them when they're struggling. Increased need for competency, lots of technology out there. The average age of our farmers is 60. So that means a lot of farmers over the age of 60. So as we're pushing out new technology, that's pretty overwhelming to keep up with. New programs, new regulations are being thrown out there all the time. Of course, income, up and down. Dairy is a little bit different. You got your milk check, that's regular income. Other, people who sell other commodities, it might not be that regular. Transition and succession planning. So Karen and I listened to the next Rural Realities podcast. We just recorded one this morning on the stress around transitioning the farm from one generation to the next. And all that's involved in that, the stress, the relationship issues, the conflict. And so listen to that to get more, and we'll touch on it a bit later. Long solitary work hours goes along with isolation. And then in our rural areas, there are barriers to get help. We don't have counselors on every street corner. Sometimes if we want to see somebody in person, we have to drive a long ways. Psychiatry, that's almost exclusively now on virtual appointments. So it's hard to access help. There's lots of barriers to access help. And if folks have high copays and deductibles, they're just like not spending money to talk about my emotions when I can't pay my bills. Not fully realizing the two could be very, very, and often are linked, right? Another thing that's interesting about this is if you look at, and I'm not really going to talk much about suicide in here, but if you look at suicide death rates in rural, it is much higher per capita than in urban areas, which is a surprise to a lot of people. And if you look at suicide death rates among egg producers, it's 2 to 3 times that of the general population, especially in older white males. In fact, males around 75 years old are like the highest age group to die by suicide of any other age group. And that's shocking to some people because we typically think about kids, right? Okay. And I wanted to, when we look at factors that impact health on the farm, I wanted to touch on grief and loss because it's something that we don't talk about a lot, and it is all around us in agriculture and on our farms. And it shows up in a lot of different ways. So I just like the quotes at the top because it kind of puts grief in perspective. It's a normal response of sorrow, heartache, and confusion that comes from losing someone or something important to you. So when we look at these farmers that have to sell their cows, or we look at farmers that are aging and they can't do the work anymore, and they are in a position of needing to turn things over. So much loss, injury, loss of limbs, loss of fingers, death of animals, so much loss on farms, loss of dreams. Like I always thought this is how it was going to be for me and my family, and it's not, and it's never going to be. That's loss. Natural disasters come through. I mean, just looking at the hurricane issue and the devastation it caused, that's loss, that's grief. And we don't always name it like that. And then we wonder why 3 months after a loss, we're struggling and we're not doing well. We don't even connect it to, sold my cows, the barn burned down, whatever. Okay, so it's just important that we think about that in the context of our egg operations because there is plenty of loss Everybody has a story. If you ask any producer about a farm accident, death on the farm, a catastrophe on the farm, they will have a story. And it's linked in trauma. Okay, so then let's talk about warning signs. How do we know that someone we work with, someone we're related to, ourselves, how do we know we're in trouble? Like, what are the indications? And every month, I should put a slide in here for this. Every month I facilitate a farm suicide loss support group. So these are people from all over the country that come virtually once a month. We sit down together and it's just them supporting each other. They're somehow connected to the farm and someone close to them has died by suicide. And for many of them, when the suicide happened, it was very much a shock. Like, I had no idea, this came out of nowhere. But then looking back, they were able to identify that there were some warning signs. Warning signs do not have to just be about suicide. Warning signs can be that someone is just struggling and spiraling downward and we've got to get some help to them, or we need to intervene. We need to have a conversation about it so they don't keep spiraling downward. So these are very, across occupations, this isn't just related to agriculture, these warning signs. But I'm going to touch on a couple that are really kind of focused on ag. One, of course, across all ages, avenues, people, if someone begins to isolate, pull away, stop going to church, stop meeting the guys for coffee at Cenex, maybe they're coming late, so they're not having the little morning meeting in the shop and they're just jumping in the tractor or heading into the barn without that conversation. If there's any pulling away, that's a warning sign. And we want to be sure to not keep letting that happen. Like, sometimes people just want to be alone and need to be alone, and that's okay. But we need to find out, is this an okay thing or are you struggling? Isolation is big. If you are hearing about someone talking about all of a sudden selling like land, livestock, equipment, and it doesn't really fit with what it seemed like the plan was for that operation. Like, what is really going on here? I got a call from a lady in North Dakota, and they ranched, and that's really all. They didn't have crops, they had beef. And she just said one day she was overhearing her husband in the next room, and he was making arrangements to sell all their livestock. And she was like, what the heck? Like, we had not talked about it. We had not discussed plans. Like, this was not a part of what we saw on the horizon. And it turned out that he was thinking about suicide. And he was kind of thinking in his mind, I'm clearing the way, clearing the path so that the family doesn't have to worry about all these things when I'm gone. So any like abrupt, if something seems abrupt or just it doesn't fit, that's a time to check in. If a farm site, buildings, fence lines, cattle are all of a sudden showing disrepair, lack of care, things are kind of going downhill, that's a sign that the producer is struggling. And anytime a producer is like, I can keep doing this, this is just what my life is about, even though they're struggling and sinking and barely treading water, we have that conversation like, your operation is only going to be as okay as you are. If you're not okay, operation's not going to be okay. And there was one dairy farmer. I get into storytelling and then my time really ticks by, so I just got to pay attention. We're doing good though. There's one dairy farmer I went to see at first visit, and I drove on to the place. I do a lot of my visits on farm. So I drove onto the place and I could just tell right away, something's going on. He had like a gravity box with corn in it, untarped, and it had been raining. Things were just all over, doors open. And it could have always been that way, granted. but it was just like warning sign immediately when I drove in that yard. He was in the barn, so we went out and stood in the milk room and talked, and he had so much insight. He was really struggling. He was very depressed. He was missing milkings, drinking a lot. So some days he just could not drag himself off the couch to even get out and feed and milk. So you can imagine what that was doing with the cows. And he said, I used to have one of the best producing herds in the county. He was in a big dairy county. And now they are producing, their production is in direct reflection of how I'm doing. And I thought that was so insightful for him to be able to know that and name that. Like, it's not like the cows are doing something wrong here. It's that you're struggling, you're sick, you're ill, you need help. So, watching for that disrepair, decline, all of a sudden cows are out all the time, and that never used to be an issue. It's like, what's going on? Something's shifted, something's changed. Injury and illness. Injury, gosh, it's when we're stressed, we are at so much more risk for injury because, and I'll talk about this more later, when we're stressed, the part of our brain that thinks and processes and makes good decisions is shut down. And so we are doing things and we're not paying attention, and then pretty soon we're caught in an auger, we're in a bad situation with a bull, or we're rolling the four-wheeler or something. So injury is definitely is a risk factor, being stressed. What else? Increased substance use. I see that a lot as a way of coping. If you have farmers that are heading into like spring planting, calving, typically there's excitement there. If there's no excitement there, that's a warning sign. Those statements and feelings of hopelessness. And sometimes it's the family. Like if you think about a balloon, if you squeeze the balloon, it kind of like pushes out, right, through your fingers. That's often what it's like in a family system, because it's a system like gears that if one person's off or if one person's struggling, it impacts the whole system. So we'll see that if there's difficulty or stress in the parents, the kids might start having problems in school. They might start getting into trouble. They might start missing school. I had one family that all of a sudden this kid who was really pretty responsible and doing well was getting picked up for DUIs, getting suspended, and it was really stress in the household. I've even heard, and we have a veterinarian here, so you tell me if this is true, that when you're working with the animals, you can often tell, like I've heard people say, small animal, especially vets, when people have brought in their dogs or cats over the course of years, you know them, you know the owners, and they can pick up if those animals are acting different, that they're feeding off of the stress of their owners. True? Okay. And I mean, when I go back to my showing days, I know that when I was stressed because I was heading into the show ring and there was tons of other cattle in the class and all the things, I mean, the animals misbehave, right? It's just what happens. Okay. So, with all that kind of background on foundation set, let's talk about what happens to us when we get stressed. Because I think sometimes when we know when we're feeling stressed, but when we can think about the way it's flowing through our system, we can get better control of it and think before maybe we react, okay? So, first thing that happens is there's the stressful incident. The thing about that is it doesn't even have to actually be happening. It can be what we're worried about happening or we're afraid will happen in the future. So when we're like perseverating on the what ifs and worst case scenario, we're still going to have a stress response, even though the thing hasn't even happened. So for people that are worriers and they're thinking out worst case scenario, sometimes they're going through the hit of that stressor twice, and sometimes they're going through it and it doesn't even happen in the end. So we have the stressful incident, either real or imagined, worried about, and immediately things start to kick off in the brain. There's a small little almond part in our brain, like right here. It's called the amygdala, and it's where all of our memories and all of our emotions are connected. So that is why when you hear, let's say, a song from your teenage years, and it brings back good memories of being with friends or whatever, you have that good feeling. That's because your emotions and memories are stored in this little part of your brain. That's also where information immediately goes for your brain to decide, is this stressful? Is this going to upset my stability? Is this going to be a source of problems? Or is it okay? All based on previous experience. If amygdala says this is going to be a source of problems, then it goes on to the next thing, the hypothalamus, and then it makes all those things happen in our body. Adrenaline goes up, heart beats faster, blood pressure, pulse rate, rapid shallow breathing, our senses get really sharp, and we release glucose and fats to give ourselves energy. So this is a built-in life-saving mechanism in our brains and bodies. So it leads to our stress response, fight or flight. There's also freeze and fawn, but we won't go into all that. Imagine if we were out in a pasture, bull is chasing us. Because of this, we don't have to sit down and run through our options. Like, we don't have to say, A, we could run, B, we could yell, C, we could play dead, I don't know. We don't have to do that because our brain kicks in and we react and respond, typically running. This is the same life-saving mechanism, though, that kicks in our day-to-day stress. That doesn't, it's not life or death. But let's say we get into a power struggle with dad who we're farming with, or the kids won't get on the bus and get going in the morning when they're supposed to, or we get a bill in the mail or a letter from a regulatory agency, it kicks this off. And we go into fight or flight, often, or freeze or fawn. But effective when it's life or death, not as effective when it's everyday life stuff. Many of our egg producers live in chronic stress, meaning, let me just see what the next slide is. I don't know if I talk about this on the next slide. Yeah, okay, chronic stress. Meaning that they never get that break. So typically there's a stress response. Let's say you're walking, you see a snake, 99% of you would be like, ah, you know, and we'd back up and go. And then snake goes, and within a few moments, we're like, blood pressure goes back down, breathing's normal, we return to baseline, we return to normal. For many of our producers, they have operated in chronic stress for so long that their brains and bodies are tapped out. It's kind of like the example I use is, any Texas people in here? Oh, pretend you're at the Alamo and you're like, you know, back in the day, and they're guarding, you know, that's the fortress. And so they're doing their things, shoeing their horses and cleaning their guns, I don't know. and all of a sudden there's like dust on the horizon, and the yell goes out, and everybody grabs their weapons and goes to the gates or the top, and they're ready to fight, right? Stress response. And then they realize it's just like a wagon train going through. So like, okay, go back to what we were doing. People in chronic stress are like always up there ready to defend the Alamo. Like their blood pressure's up, their heart rate's up. They've been stressed over the course of time to the point that they're probably burnt out. They're probably having physical impacts from the stress, stomach issues, headaches, even some chronic disease kinds of things. Stiffness, inflammation, so much is tied to stress. So when we are working with, for those of you that work with farmers and ranchers, it is so important that you understand that they are a group as a whole that are chronically stressed. They haven't had the opportunity or found a way to have the opportunity to just, it's going to be okay. Don't have to worry about prices. Don't have to worry about weather. Don't have to worry about production. I can just be calm about it. I mean, that's the goal, right? Because worry doesn't get us anywhere. We want to change that into problem solving. But when we are working with folks who are chronically stressed, I'll just skip over this. There are some things that are important to remember. One is that we just listen. And I know for those of you who are in ag industry and you're working with farmers, you're probably spending 45 minutes of your hour on issues outside of why you're there. And then you get like a little 15 minutes to do business, right? That's just the nature of it because these folks are tapped out. They're stressed, and that's what's on their mind. Be really clear and concise. So if there's something you need from them, something you want them to know, and this is even in families, be really clear, think bullet point versus narrative. Because when someone is chronically stressed, their brain does not have the capacity to take all this stuff in. So just bottom line, what do you need? If they want more, they can ask for more, right? But don't overwhelm them with stuff. Write it down. And this is what I tell my farmers who are working on their own stress. Write some things down. Your brain is already overwhelmed. Don't make it hold on to more than it has to. Write things down or put it in your phone or whatever. So if you're working with farmers and you need something from them or you need them to remember something, make it visual, write it down, do a pie chart, doesn't matter. It's something so they can see it and understand it and know it versus them trying to take it in just auditorily. Checking in. This is so important. Gosh, across all levels, not just chronic stress, but when we start seeing warning signs, when someone's on our mind, when we're getting a gut feeling like, oh, somebody is struggling, just check in. If you're getting that instinct about somebody that, something's just not right with them, that's your wisdom as a human being picking something up in another human being. Do not discount that gut feeling or that instinct or that intuition. Check in with them. And checking in does not mean you have to have this really deep therapy session. Checking in can just mean, haven't seen you for a while. How are things going? Crop prices are really bad right now. I was thinking about you. How's it going? Just check in. Provide resources. Often, I love it when I can sit down with a group of ag business folks because they are then armed with, if I'm meeting with people who are struggling, these are resources that I can point them to. So I've had people call me because their agronomist gives them my card or their loan officer gives them my card. And so if you're working with farmers, find out what's in your area that can help them, whether it's on the financial side, legal side, mental health side, and have those resources. Just carry them around with you. Okay. So let's talk about what do we do for ourselves. Because we've talked about stress, and I kind of use stress and mental health interchangeably because stress is really what's impacting mental health in a lot of ways. So what do we do for ourselves to feel better when we feel maybe like we're spiraling downward, we're buried, we're overwhelmed, we're frustrated? What do we do? The biggest thing we can do is understand that the battle is often fought in our mind. The majority of the time, the battle is fought in our mind with our own thinking. So my number one thing I do, I mean, there's a lot of things. There's taking care of yourself physically, because gosh, if you're dehydrated and not eating decent and you're stressed, certainly not going to help you, right? It's going to be worse. So take care of yourselves physically. Surround yourself with good, solid people. Get in touch with, I call it your spiritual protective factor. What gives you hope in life? What brings you joy? What feeds your soul? Like, we need to grab onto that, especially when we're stressed, whatever that looks like. But the thinking piece is a lot of what I do, in counseling. And the next slide is going to be the thoughts, feelings, actions connection, so I'll get there. But the main points I want to get across is that we have all kinds of thoughts going through our mind every day, thousands. We do not have to grab on and believe everyone. So just taking some time to understand, are the thoughts that I'm allowing to float around in my mind helping me, or are they not helping me? Is there any benefit for me telling myself, I'm a horrible farmer, this is never going to get better, I'm going to be out of business by the end of the year? No benefit, right? In fact, on the next slide, I'll show you how it actually it's very detrimental. So intentional thinking, challenging those negative thoughts. Part of that is really focusing on what you control. Many times our negative thoughts are around other people, what they're doing to us, how they're impacting us, and that's a whole nother hour-long talk right there. But we get to control that. We do. It's about boundaries, it's about not allowing somebody to push our buttons. That's what people say. They're pushing my buttons. They push my buttons all the time. They're your buttons. You control them. So if you don't want somebody pushing your buttons, you better relocate them, something. So it's taking ownership of what we're allowing ourselves to think about. Okay? A lot of times what's helpful when we're in that place of worry, nothing's wrong with any emotion. They just are. But they can either be helpful, more helpful, less helpful. So when we're in that place of worry, it's not helping us move anywhere or accomplish anything. We're just kind of stuck there. In fact, it can be detrimental. If we can take that and transfer it into more of a problem-solving mentality, I could sit and worry about this all day long, and what is that going to benefit me? Or, what can I do about this? Let me put a plan in place. What about this do I have control over? What do I not have control over? If I don't have control over it, how can I distract myself so I'm not thinking about it? If I don't have control over it, what action plan can I put in place so I can deal with it in a better way? So that is the making a plan. It can shift your brain functioning from that emotional part to the thinking, rational, problem-solving part just by virtue of making a plan. I did this with my kids a lot when they were teenagers, and I don't know if any of you have teenagers. Emotional brain is developing very quickly. Thinking, rational brain, they say now, isn't fully developed till someone's 26, which I'm seeing playing out in my children who are in their early 20s. The closer the oldest gets to 26, the better decisions he's making. So I'm like, okay, we're almost there. That's why parents, I call parents, you are your kids' prefrontal cortex. You need to think and be reasonable and rational for them because they don't have that ability yet. Where was I going with that? Okay, so when you switch from worry, anxiety, worst case scenario thinking to I'm going to make a plan, I'm going to put down some action steps, I'm going to make a to-do list, that gets that problem-solving, rational part of your brain kicked in. And it eases the emotional side that's been firing and taking over. Okay? Yes. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Because if it doesn't work, there's definitely repercussions. Yep. 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 Yeah. Yes. And that's the difference. Are you preparing and problem solving and planning, or are you worrying and having anxiety? And like, is it emotionally based or is it thought based? Yep. That brings us right here to the next slide, actually. No, I think that's a really good point, though, because it doesn't mean that we don't plan, prepare. We're not looking through rose-colored glasses that it's just this glorious, nothing's going to be wrong, everything's going to be great when things are burning down around you. Like there is an element of preparation and planning. The difference is are we in an emotional frame of mind which impedes our ability to think and plan, or are we in a rational problem solving? Are we using our thinking versus our emotions? And you're right, often it's a mix, but what happens is if we're not careful, the emotions take over, and then we do things that to other people seem very irrational, because they probably are, because we're not thinking clearly. Our rational brain is shut off. And this is all happening in your brain. Like there's nothing flawed about you. This is how our brain is set up to work. And it goes back to, it's meant to be a life-saving mechanism. So if we sense danger, if we sense that our stability is being rocked, if we sense the rug's going to be pulled out from under us, we immediately go into that, we've got to keep ourselves safe. That's our brain's job. And so it's not a bad thing, it's just how do we make it work for us when it's not necessarily life or death. So what happens, let me just see if I missed anything in this one. Oh, I put mindfulness on there just because in the heat of the moment, when panic is rising, when stress is rising, anxiety is rising, and we're having trouble slowing down the thoughts and just, that is something that can be helpful, a helpful practice. And all it is that you are tuning into your five senses. I mean, it's super simple. Most guys, when they see mindfulness, are like, oh my gosh, we gotta do yoga or something. That's not what it's about. Mindfulness is just like, I'm just gonna take a few moments and really focus on what am I seeing right now? And then what am I hearing? What textures are around me? Sense of touch. Run through your five senses. Your brain can only actively be thinking about one thing at a time. So if you can replace your speeding thoughts with just some focus, it can help slow things down. Okay? Okay, so thoughts, feelings, actions, connection. He had the perfect example. Our thoughts drive how we feel. Our thoughts and feelings then drive how we function, or our behavior, or our actions. And that often reinforces our original thought. So a good example of this is having the thought, I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. What feelings does that elicit? If your thought is, I'm not good enough, I can't do this, I'm failing. Sadness, insecurity, worthlessness. So if you're having that thought, I can't do this, I'm no good at this, everything I touch gets destroyed, goes downhill, you have that set of feelings, whatever that may be, how able are you going to be to make good decisions? To be motivated to get out there and do what you have to do in a day? To be present in your relationships? You're not. So that reinforces that original thought, like, I can't do this. I'm screwing everything up. I'm no good at this. Everything I touch turns to cow poop. It doesn't work. That is driven by our thinking. So if your thought is, I've got to, if your thought is, there could be a disaster. There could be, I don't know, what's your thought that drives some of this? Yep. Yep. So you're into E and F, potentially. Yep. Yes. You're feeling the feelings. Right. And then does that impede you from being able to put good plans into action that make sense? Okay. So you're managing your emotions. You're managing your emotions. That would fall under actions. That would not be a very productive thing to do. Yeah. Yeah. So this is just kind of a guide. If you are having a thought that's not been helpful for you, run it through this scenario. Like, how do you feel? A lot of times for me, I notice my feelings first. And I'm like, why am I so frustrated? Why am I so irritated? Why am I so nervous? And then I kind of peel back the layers and I get to what thought is driving that. Did something happen? Did I read something? Did somebody say something? And then I deal with that thought. Like, is this something I have control over? Sometimes I'll say, like, what's the worst case scenario? I was just having a phone call with, I wish I could remember the situation now. I was just having a phone call with a farmer yesterday, and the way they dealt with it was, what's the worst thing that can happen? And the worst thing that could happen was not insurmountable at all. So then they're like, okay. Then I make a plan to move forward and deal with it. I don't have to be amped up about it all the time. I can just rationally make a plan to deal with it. And this goes both ways. Your thoughts can be really good, really positive, and that drives good feelings. That drives motivation. It drives growth. It drives, a good, this can be good or helpful or unhelpful. I'll say that, not good or bad. Okay. For a couple of resources, I just put 988. Have you guys heard of 988? It's the new, not new, it's like 2 years old now, but it used to be the 1-800 blah, 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 suicide lifeline. They changed it just to 988, and now it's a suicide and crisis lifeline. So, like, I have one farmer who 988 is his go-to at night when he knows other people are sleeping and he can't get a hold of us. So he'll just text 988. Just a little warning, there is some upfront demographic stuff they collect, and a lot of people give up and hang up or quit texting before they get through that. But you will be connected to a live person. and they go by, I think, your area code, right? It'll be local to where your area code is. So if your area code is somewhere you don't live, you may get somebody from there, no big deal. And then the other thing I put on here is Farm Bureau, National Farm Bureau, put like a listserv together, and you can search by state for resources, mental health resources, and some are absolutely farm, ag related, and some are more general, but it's at least a good place to start for finding resources. Okay, I'm going to give you my contact info. At any time, if there's something you want to talk through, if you're feeling stuck, like next steps, who do I call? I'm very happy to have a conversation with you, so call, text, email, and we can just chat and go from there. Okay, I saved 10 minutes for questions, comments, stories, examples. If it's something you're struggling with, you totally can say, I have a friend who is going through this.
Questions, anyone? We'd like it to be on the microphone, so if anybody's listening live, they can hear the question. Anybody?
It's always a tough thing in a mental health presentation to be like.
So if you're working with someone who is past that, where they're wrapped up into the chronic stress,
Yep.
is there a good way to try to stop and point out or get them in the right direction?
Yeah, so some people are, and they maybe have been for years, really geared up. So they're not functioning well, they're not making good decisions, their rationality is gone. And it may just be something as simple as like, let's just sit down and have a conversation. Like, tell me about the history of the farm. I did that with one guy. This was just a couple weeks ago. I was sitting down at the kitchen table with a guy, and he was ramped up. So I'm like, just talk me through the history of the farm. Well, that started him on all the bad things that have happened over the years. And he was like, part of it he blamed on his nutritionist. And he's like, do you work with a nutritionist? And I said, no, I don't. And he goes, well, if you do, shoot the bugger. I was like, okay, we have more work to do here. But no, if you can get them breathing, like physically relaxing, focusing on something that kind of puts the other things to the wayside. I mean, don't discount the benefit of slow, deep breathing, honestly. Sometimes, and many times people in chronic stress have not taken slow, deep breaths for a long time. So they're not getting oxygen into their system the way they should be. So if we can just pause, let's just sit down, just take some slow, deep breaths. Let's just talk this through. And then what's a plan? What's a first step? And try to get them to start thinking rationally. Like, okay, this is the problem. This feels like it's totally out of control. What is a little tiny first step we can take? Is it just calling somebody to schedule a meeting? Is it, I mean, any little thing that they can commit to as a first step is a win. Because if we start thinking, looking big change, big picture, talk about overwhelming to someone who's chronically stressed. That's where we get stuck in a lot of transition succession planning things, is that we're looking at this whole big thing and it's too much, so we do nothing. We're frozen.
Anyone else have questions?
Do you see more stress post-COVID than we did pre-COVID?
That's a good question. Well, I started working directly with farmers in 2019, so I don't have a lot of and in all my years before, you know, I had some farm clients, but not exclusively. I think what we see post-COVID is still a reluctance to connect with other people. So I think the isolation piece, which, if you read, the Surgeon General put out a public health advisory, I think he called it, last year or the year before, on loneliness and isolation in our country, and it being like an epidemic. And when I first saw that, I'm like, well, of course, COVID post-COVID. He started this research in 2017. So it was a problem prior to us being isolated and like losing connections. So I've seen that. I still see, just system-wide things that are really causing stress for farmers. Lack of workforce, slow, getting parts in, things like that that are driving stress. So those are kind of like the after lingering effects of COVID.
Is it generational too?
There are definitely generational differences. Gosh, listen to that Rural Realities podcast. We talked about that. Like for the older generation, when they're looking at turning things over, what I see when I'm working with families is there's grief and loss issues that are not being talked about. And there's this feeling like, I don't think the younger generation is going to be able to maintain what I've built, because they don't have the same work ethic, they don't have the same priorities, whatever. That kind of drives some stress in the older generation. But there's just differences. Some of the older generation are in a good place, and so they're just kind of sitting back and watching their legacy take place. There's, health issues can come into play.
I guess I was referring to generational as meaning, it seemed like, I would date myself. But,
Yeah.
When we were growing up, our age,
Yep.
you talk to people on the phone, you talk to them personally, and
Yeah.
you develop certain skills. And it seems the younger generation is more social media, texting. Those skill sets seem to sometimes be lacking.
Oh, 100%. Yes, I would agree. Not that the older generation has a great communication across the board, because I will say that's not true, because they haven't always learned how to communicate well, but you had to communicate on some level, where now we can send an email, we can send a text, and we're lacking that really art of being able to communicate effectively.
One more question? Anybody?
Hi, thank you for a very insightful presentation. I'm just wondering and putting a little bit of a different perspective on the animal side of things.
Yeah.
A lot of the times when we have to approach animal welfare issues on farm, there is a mental health issue associated with it,
Yep.
and there is also scientific evidence behind that as well. So I'm wondering about your perspectives on how to approach that when we're called for animal welfare issues. We're having these very difficult conversations, and underlying issues are really very clear that there is something more behind that. And how does the mental health issues from the people in charge affect the animal welfare of the animals?
That's such a good question, and so true, right? Because our functioning is going to impact how we take care of family, animals, farm, and talk about an emotionally charged situation, right? When those conversations are happening. So again, I would go toward, let's make a plan. Like, you're here, and this is not okay, and we have to be here for it to be okay. How do we move there? Like, what is a change you are willing to make right now to start the process moving? And that can sometimes, if they're coming into the meeting thinking, I'm going to lose my animals, I'm going to have charges, I'm going to whatever, they might be thinking worst case scenario. So maybe starting off with, it may not be worst case scenario. Like, if we can make a plan, if you can make improvements, we can work with you. And so I think that's huge. Part of that plan can be, you seem to be really struggling. Who can you go to for some help for you? They may say, no way, or they may be open to that. But if they're faced with, I need to get some help so I can hang on to my farm or my animals, it might be enough of a driver for them to seek out something. And I would have resources with you that you could give them, that here are some numbers you can call to seek some help. So yeah, you're in a difficult position with that because you're kind of seen as the enemy. So how am I'm not going to be taking advice that I need help from, you know, the enemy. But yeah, I think if you just approach it like this is not a done deal, well, let's just talk through a plan calmly, rationally. But clearly you're upset, you're struggling. How do we get you some help so that the animals are taken care of? Yeah.
Okay, thank you to Monica for all the information.
Yeah.
Round of applause, please. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. We do have evaluation forms. I think most of you have them in hand. If not, they're in the back. We'd love your feedback. And thank you again to Monica.
Yeah.
And have a great day.
Yes, you're welcome. I hope it was good. They stayed.